Yeah, sure, no camera for today, because on top of being sleep deprived, I'm also naked, because apparently it's completely normal to have 32 degrees on the 9th of October. Now, complaints about the weather aside, today we are also going over the second part of what we looked at yesterday, which is the results of Mythic raid testing that happened this weekend, this time though for healers. After looking at the DPS performances yesterday, today is the time of the other quite relevant role of specs in Mythic raiding. I'm sorry, thanks, your Mythic raid logs are just not that important. We left the Mythic raid testing last week at Smolderon before the latest round of testing, and we had a recap which showed the 3 better performing healers overall, being Preservation Evoker, Mistweaver Monk and Holy Paladin. Restoration Druid and Discipline Priest were somewhat close behind, and then the 2 weakest performers were Holy Priest and Restoration Shaman. We had, throughout that time, another round of testing which did touch a few of the healing specs in both round of changes, so maybe something else is changing in the results of the healers as well, starting with Larodar, the first of the Mythic tests done last Thursday. The colors of the top performers are somewhat reminiscent of what we checked last time, because the colors are Mistweaver, Preservation and Holy Paladin, which is just what we talked about were the better performers last week. There is, you know, a couple of more unique colors in here, perhaps one being Restoration Shaman, for example, which we weren't used to seeing in the previous logs. Shaman was, you know, the second worst on Smolderon, the third worst on Council, it was the last place on Igira, so on Larodar they have a much better performance. Now this might be somewhat relevant and related, given that this test was done on the 5th of October. This might be relevant with this set of changes happening on the 3rd of October, which did touch Restoration Shaman with the 20% buff to Chain Heal. So if you do go and check one of these logs, one of these long-lasting logs, which is quite nice, you know, an 8-minute log shows you quite a lot of the healing, well, you can see the effects of the buff, because now we do have a much higher use of Chain Heal than before. Remember, when we were looking at the previous logs, we were lamenting the performance of Restoration Shaman and the boredom generated by the tier set. Restoration Shaman was effectively just casting even more healing waves than Riptides. You were a bot, as we mentioned, you were a whack-a-mole bot, where because you wanted to spread as many Tidal Reservoir as possible, because Riptide ticking with a target with Tidal Reservoir has a chance to spread Riptide on a nearby ally, the spells that could apply Tidal Reservoir were one of these 3. And unfortunately, Chain Heal was just too weak to be considered, on top of costing way too much mana. So the result was that an average healing wave was out-healing an average Chain Heal, which is not generally what you want to see. Now the average Chain Heal is healing for 500,000 and the average healing wave for 150. That's a bit more of a chunky hit. Of course, you know, this guy is technically cheating, because if you play with things like Unleash Life, Chain Heal can heal for much more. If you play with things like Chain Heal bounces an additional time and the healing is increased, of course, it gets a much stronger bonus on top of High Tide to get Chain Heal even stronger. So this is what we were pointing out last time. This buff might have pushed Resto Shaman to go back to playing a little bit more around Chain Heal. So going back to take the 1, the 2, the 3 talents that can boost your Chain Heal, because now it has become a much stronger AoE heal than before. You can see how much it is contributing to the burst healing of Resto Shaman. It's definitely a resurgence, no pun intended, of Resto Shaman in performance in 10.2 thanks to some balance tuning. So exactly what you want to see from a PTR. Fixing and adjusting some of the weaker specs. No surprise, meanwhile, that the 3 better performing specs were not really changed greatly, if not, buffed greatly in the PTR. If anything, Preservation back in the first round had gotten a slight change to the set. This was a slight buff, but nothing major. Monk was getting changes to their defensiveness more than their overall healing, and then in the next round of tuning, Holy Paladin wasn't touched at all. Mystery Monk also received very few changes, and Evoker Preservation received no changes. So their performance continued. Most of these nice performances are going to be using the same build that we can put on display for everyone to see. We have the Holy Paladin, which is the one that is changing by far the least compared to basically now. This is what we talked about before, the fact that Holy Paladin can now play way more with Flash of Light, casting way more of them compared to before. You can see it in the damage done. Now it's casting only 5 Crusader Strikes. Now the damage of Holy Paladin has gone down to be much lower than before, much lower than the usual Holy Paladin. Then you have the other well-performing. You have the Mistweaver Monk, which continues to have tons of value with Invigorating Mists thanks to their tier set. The tier set of Mistweaver Monk, which allows them to spread a very powerful 50% heal increase for 8 seconds to the targets that have Renewing Mist applied to them by the Mistweaver Monk. Not the free jumps of Renewing Mist, just the ones casted by the Monk. So you have Renewing Mist on players, the players receive 50% more healing. It's time to use a whole bunch of Vivify on players to spread AoE healing on all of them. That is basically what Monk has been doing on the PTR, and then benefit from the AoE explosion of the 4-piece set bonus, which is gonna be around here. So that's how Mystery Monk has been doing, and then you have, of course, Evoker, which has been going quite heavily on Emerald Blossom, just like right now on live Evoker is doing. This guy is even tryharding a little bit too much on the PTR by using the amulet for PTR testing, but the point is Emerald Blossom right now in the PTR, also thanks to the very powerful tier set of Evoker. It has to be a very powerful tier set considering it's only a 2-piece set bonus. This is a bug. I'm gonna fix it right here. There is a bug here that actually shows something that doesn't exist. There you go. This is the actual tier set of Preservation Evoker, and it's very powerful. It's unique of Blizzard to only give one set bonus to one specific spec, but this set bonus alone is generating a lot of free casts of your spenders, which translate to a lot of casts of blossoms, which translate to a lot of healing. The actual Living Flames casts by your Empower spells are not bad either. They are, a decent amount of healing, but the real point is the amount of spenders you can use and the amount of free Emerald Blossoms you can cast with this new tier set. This, for example, is a 210 seconds long fight, and there are 36 casts of Emerald Blossom. I definitely did not just cut the video to use a calculator and tell you that this is 1 Emerald Blossom cast every 5.8 seconds, which is a lot. Now, this performance of the healers is gonna continue more or less on the good ones on the other bosses, like the last one being tested, although the duration was quite short, so this is not nearly as relevant for healers. We said this was good for DPS because you could check their burst damage, you could check their, Bloodlust on pull type of burst damage. For healers, of course, is not nearly as relevant, but maybe, the burst healing of a healer might also be somewhat relevant. And we see here that Mistweaver and Preservation are amongst the highest, together with Restoration. Who is missing from having high burst healing compared to the previous bosses? We go to Council, we see Holy Paladin, we go to Smolderon, we still see Holy Paladin, we go to Larodar, still Holy Paladin, and then we go to a burst window of healing, and Holy Paladin isn't there. That's because traditionally Holy Paladin doesn't have a lot of burst healing. They have many small, quick cooldowns to use in different situations over and over, but they don't have Rewind, okay? They don't have Dream Breath. They don't have those types of large HPS cooldowns, like, for example, an Evoker that can pull this much HPS in just 1 minute. In this case, this is going to be done, of course, with a whole bunch of things like Rewind, things like Dragonflight. He even used Emerald Communion, basically just dump all the cooldowns to get a whole bunch of very high healing. So this is not too much of a surprise either. Where we do see the first perhaps problem and weakness of this spec, Preservation, which has been doing overall the best of all bosses, except for one. If you see Volcaros, you will notice that Preservation is now on the lowest level of healing. This fight has been tested upwards of a 3-minute fight. The explanation as to why Preservation is doing so little is very, very simple. If you go to one of these fights, you will notice that many Evokers, even though we just mentioned how strong Emerald Blossom is, are struggling while playing Blossom. That's because once we go on the replay of this boss fight, you will notice something different than other boss fights. The difference is the amount of spreading that happens throughout this boss fight. The amount of spreading obviously causes your Emerald Blossom to be quite significantly weaker than if you were fighting in a stacked group. This is basically all there is to it, and the reason why at the moment Preservation Evoker is that much weaker on this particular fight. If you guys played all the way back in Shadowlands, you know, as if I'm talking about ages ago, if you played in Sepulchre, you might remember, for example, Restoration Shaman being benched on one particular fight. That fight being Halondrus. Why? Because players were spread all around the boss and it was basically near impossible for the Resto Shaman to have proper good healing. So it was just benched for that particular fight, and this is likely what's gonna happen to Evoker. Evoker, of course, still have the option, if they actually bother to, if they actually want to, you can play with Blossom, but you can then also move away from Blossom to play your traditional build. This build will have more range, will have more reach when you are spreading in this fight, allowing you to be much more effective, right? So that could also be a possibility. Either you move to a different build or you get benched on this fight as an Evoker. So things right now, up to all of the specs we have mentioned, look very balanced. We haven't mentioned too much Resto Druid, because, you know, we said they were doing in the middle the last time. They weren't close to being the two weakest, Holy Priest and Resto Shaman, but they also weren't too close overall to being amongst the top two of the logs. This continued to be more or less up and down on the next round of tuning, where Restoration was the second worst on Larodar, but then it was also the best or second best on Volcaros, and then over on Tindral goes down to being average. So that's the same thing we have mentioned before for Resto Druid. You are going to continue being okay playing with this build if you don't have too many issues not seeing many of your healing done by yourself, and instead done by some other intruder spawning alongside you and healing for yourself. That's kind of the whole thing. The rest of the build, the rest of the playstyle of Resto Druid stays the exact same. It's a rejuice spam, it's a regrowth whenever you have clear casting, and it's swift mend before using wild growth. That's basically still what Resto Druid is. What we haven't mentioned yet across all of these healers and how they have been doing is just one spec, which is Holy Priest. So, we have said ever since the first boss that Holy Priest was the third worst performer. On Igira it was the second worst, on Council it was the second tied worst healer, on Smolderon it was the worst healer, on Larodar this last week they were the third worst, on Volcaros they were the second worst, and lastly on Tindral they were the only one where they actually were doing better than the other specs. Now, nothing has actually changed for Holy Priest. If we go to Priest, they have actually not really received that many changes. This was just a fix, no other changes, and in the most recent round of tuning, Priest Healer wasn't even changed. Once more, Shadow gobbling up all of the attention of Blizzard. So, despite not receiving many changes, the situation of Holy Priest is quite confusing, because their tier set is very strong. This tier set is very powerful. It changes completely your focus from focusing around Prayer of Mending into Renew. your Serenity applies single target renew, your Sanctify applies 5 seconds of AoE renew, and then the 4-piece showers you in a lot of extra free holy wards. This is very relevant in your build as a holy priest. It has tons of synergy because, for example, Salvation used to have a 30-second cooldown reduction whenever you use a spender. This 4-piece is so strong, allows you to cast so many more holy wards that Blizzard had to nerf the cooldown of Salvation from 30 seconds to 15. And you still have the same cooldown of Salvation in the next patch. That's how much more spenders, how much more Sanctify and Serenity you're going to be casting. You're going to be casting twice as many as you are now. This is of course very good. It's very good because Divine Image spawns when you use a Holy Ward for healing, which means if you're casting twice as many, Divine Image will spawn twice as often. You can make use of previously unknown and never used talents like Rapid Recovery. Now Renew Healing is increased by 35%. That will also have very good value with your new tier set. You already had quite a decent amount of throughput of consistent healing as a healer, and you are one of the healers with a pretty good, well-scaling mastery. It's literally an extra healing increase on all of your direct healing, which scales quite well deeper into a tier. Perhaps not as much now because Renew doesn't count as part of your mastery, so technically, yeah, it gets a little bit weaker with this mastery. But despite all of this supposed synergy for Holy, they have not really been performing nearly as well. Now, to be fair, it's quite a change in playstyle compared to how you have been playing now. You do have, as mentioned, to cast twice as many Holy Wards. Perhaps not many Holy Priests have gotten the hang of the build in the PTR, maybe. But at the moment, it does feel like they are amongst the more underperforming, even if we just stick to the facts, even if we just stick to the data and look at the results. They definitely are one of the more underperforming specs. This was the last healer to go through after all of these sets of testing and tuning done on the PTR. So we now leave Mythic raid testing with things across healers even more balanced than before, because now not only Preservation and Holy Paladin are doing well, now you also have Mistweaver doing well, you have a buffed Restoration Shaman doing significantly better, you still have Restoration Druid, perhaps with a more boring playstyle, but still doing quite well. You have Discipline Priest still being average, at the very least certainly better than the state they are in right now in live. So really, at the moment, the only healer that looks like it's a little bit behind the rest for an otherwise very, very balanced set of healers is Holy Priest. If we somehow manage in our next round of tuning to actually adjust Holy Priest a little bit more with a few quality of life changes, like for example, this one doesn't give you a next charge not to be spent, but instead grants you a new charge. This will help a lot the way the set works for Holy Priest, or a few other buffs to some of their healing spells. It might make the healing roster one of the more balanced, one of the more even roster we have had so far. At the very least on paper, at the very least on theory crafting levels, it does look very, very even, very, very balanced at the moment for the raid. We haven't gone in detail too much yet about the Mythic Plus, which we will go over in the next 1 or 2 days about how things have been going in Mythic Plus as well when it comes to healers. So for now, this is what we have with our last bit of Mythic raid testing on the PTR for healers as well. I'm going to leave you to do your own conclusions about the state of healers in the PTR for the next patch, because now I have to leave. I feel like I'm gonna fall asleep at any moment right now. So thanking as usual first all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, as well as everyone else who is doing it currently for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. So with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I don't really know. It must be the heat. How did I end up making a video talking about 7 specs longer than a video talking about the entirety of the DPS? How?